যদি সবাই ফিরে যায়, ওরে ওরে ও ভাগা সবাই ফিরে যায়, যদি গহন পথে যাওয়ার কালে কেউ ফিরে না যায়, তবে পথের কাটা তুই রক্ত মাখা চরণ তলে একলা দলরে, তুই রক্ত মাখা চরণ তলে একলা দলরে, যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে। যদি আলো না ধরে, ওরে ওরে ও ভাগা আলো না ধরে, যদি ঝড় বাদলে আধার রাতে দুয়ার দেয় ঘরে, তবে বজ্রানলে আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে, আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে, যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে। একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো রে।
Hi guys, thank you for joining the live stream. I hope the audio is doing all right. Okay, so today we are going to discuss a research article after a long time. This paper is pretty infamous and as well as famous. This is very popular amongst libertarians. I have heard of this paper from in libertarian circles countless times, and I have received recommendations about this paper many times. It's controversial as well because a lot of people have called this disrespectful to the good intentions of the Indian state, etc. Anyway, it's written by people who are economics professors. Let's see what do these professors think. Now you know what do economics professors usually think, which is socialism is great. Let's see what do these two professors think. SHRUTI Rajagopalan and Alexander Tabarrok. We will get to their paper a little later, but first I will just read out to you a small gist of the paper, okay, for those of you who are too impatient to get through the entire paper but do want to know what the paper is all about. Here's a gist of the paper from ChatGPT, okay. Let me tell you about the gist first, and then we will get into who are these people. So the overview, mainly 2 points. The paper explores India as a flailing state, not failing state, one whose ambitions exceed its capacity. Capacity for what? Capacity to implement policies. It tries to do too much in scope, but has too few resources to execute effectively. I have read about just this gist and first one paragraph. So far, I have absolutely loved the paper, And listen to this very first point in the overview. What a great point to bring up, I think, isn't it? That I think even when people point out to us, pro-free market people in India, socialists, who point out to us that, see, no such great freebies or entitlement programs exist in Europe. What about that? How are they functioning, bro? Because they are richer. When they started out doing that, they were way richer than us already. So let's get rich first, maybe. Okay, the other point of this paper is the authors coin premature imitation, which is elites in India adopt policies suitable for advanced economies. Exactly what we were talking about. Before India has the administrative and institutional infrastructure to support them. This mismatch leads to policy failures. Some core insights from the paper now, okay? 5 core insights. Flailing state concept. The Indian state is described as both too large in terms of ambitions, regulations, and scope of intervention, and too small, lacking effective capacity to deliver services and enforce its own rules. Premature demand for advanced policies. Domestic elites push for policies meant for high capacity governments. These include, so we know who these two professors are talking about when they use the phrase domestic elites, right? These two economics professors and scholars who have written this paper are not your run-of-the-mill economics professors. I'm sure you are getting that already. And when they say domestic elites, they don't exactly mean the people you might think when people like Amartya Sen would use the phrase. Domestic elites push for policies meant for high capacity governments. These include high maternity leave, urban housing regulations, and complex sanitation and education reforms, despite inadequate on the ground capacity. Point 3. 4 illustrative case studies. The paper examines how these mismatched policies play out in A. Maternity leave, lengthy leave policies that small firms struggle to administer. Housing policy, models reliant on bureaucratic and planning capacities that often fail in practice. Open defecation, policies assuming sanitation infrastructure and behavior change capabilities that may not exist in many regions. Education reform, a push for school accountability and regulation in a system with limited enforcement, teacher variability, and resource gaps. Next, the role of external influence. International agencies, donors, and foreign academic models contribute to state overreach. They may push ambitious project designs without ensuring that India's existing systems can deliver them effectively or not. Okay. Foreign NGOs. Okay. So this paper is kind of talking about what Indian right wingers always like to point out. International agencies, donors, and foreign academic models contribute to this phenomenon of state overreach. Okay, guys. They may be pushing ambitious project designs without ensuring India's existing systems can deliver effectively. Towards smarter state building, the conclusion advocates for capability-aware policy design. Start with simpler, manageable policies that improve administrative capability over time. The authors suggest incrementalism, adaptation to local contexts, and experimentation rather than rigid transplanting of idealized models. That's pretty much the gist of the paper. Now we will get into the paper. Let me check some comments now before we start the paper. Yeah, Polymer, finally this topic. Yes, probably you as well. Ram Rishabh. Lant Princhet is the writer of this article. He is a great development economist. Which article, Polymerase? Because it's written by Shruti Rajagopalan and Alexander Tabarrok, apparently, right? They do talk about Lance Pritchett. Rishabh is saying, if that ambition is building good roads, I agree totally. People in India see Google offices and desire that, but aren't willing to go through the times when Google's founders used to work 7 days a week out of a garage. Your hand looks big today. Nice. I'm thinking of buying Beyond Good and Evil. Is it easy to read book or very advanced? It's advanced. Basically, European socialism tatti hai, idhar mat chepo. Yeah. Okay. Let's start the paper now. Oh, okay. He created that term. This article is based on his larger paper. I see. So this is the paper, guys. Premature Imitation and India's Flailing State. Shruti Gopalan, and Alexander Tabarrok. Starts with a quote from W. Arthur Lewis from his work Economic Development with Unlimited Supplies of Labor. The quote is, there is the same contrast even between people, between the few highly westernized, trousered natives educated in Western universities, speaking Western languages and glorifying in Beethoven, Mill, Marx, or Einstein, and the great mass of their countrymen who live in quite other worlds. Nice. Gautam Varun is saying, do I need to read anything more to understand that book? Read. There's an endless numbers of commentaries on Beyond Good and Evil. You can check them out. A more easier assistance I would suggest would be from Jordan Peterson's lectures on Nietzsche, or specifically on Beyond Good and Evil. You will find many great ones. Lant Pritchett in 2009 has called India a flailing state. A flailing state is what happens when the principal cannot control its agents. The flailing state cannot implement its own plans and may have its plans actively subverted when its agents work at cross purposes. The Indian state flails because it is simultaneously too large and too small. Too large because the Indian government attempts to legislate and regulate every aspect of citizens' lives, and too small because it lacks the resources and personnel to rule according to its own ambitions. To explain the mismatch between the Indian state's ambitions and its abilities, We point to the premature demands by Indian elite for policies more appropriate to a developed country. We illustrate with 4 case studies on maternity leave, housing policy, open defecation, and education policy. We then conclude by discussing how the problem of limited state capacity points to presumptive laissez faire as a preferred governing and learning environment for developing countries. Who is Shruti Rajagopalan? Why am I having such a hard time pronouncing this name? Shruti Rajagopalan. So, Shruti Rajagopalan is Assistant Professor of Economics in the Department of Economics at Purchase College, State University of New York, and a Fellow at the Classical Liberal Institute, New York University School of Law. Alexander TABARROK is Bartley J. Madden Chair in Economics and Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center, as well as Professor of Economics at George Mason University. जब किसी का बायो और मतलब सिर्फ कौन सी इंस्टीट्यूशन से जुड़े हैं ये पढ़ने में 15 मिनट बीत जाए तो समझ लो कि it's pretty big shot stuff. Matt Andrews, Lant Pritchett, and Michael Woolcock in 2017 point to one explanation for India's flailing state. In order to satisfy external actors, the Indian state and other recipients of foreign funding often take on tasks that overwhelm state capacity, leading to premature load bearing. As these authors put it, by starting off with unrealistic expectations of the range, complexity, scale, and speed with which organizational capability can be built, external actors set both themselves and, more importantly, the government they are attempting to assist to fail. The expectations of external actors are only one source of imitation, however. Who people read, listen to, admire, learn from, and wish to emulate is also key. We argue that another factor driving inappropriate imitation is that the Indian intelligentsia, the top people involved in politics, the bureaucracy, universities, think tanks, foundations, and so forth, are closely connected with Anglo-American elites, sometimes even more closely than they are to the Indian populace. As a result, the Indian elite initiates and supports policies that appear to it to be normal, even though such policies may have little relevance to the Indian population as a whole and may be wildly at odds with Indian state capacity. This paper is incredibly interesting to me so far because this seems to be full of stuff that Hindutva socialists, people who believe in the concept of Sanatan economics, would agree with. On the other hand, it could the solutions it offers would be accused of being Western capitalism propaganda. This kind of mimicry of what appear to be the best Western policies and practices is not necessarily ill-intentioned. That same old, not ill-intentioned intentions. The barrage and tsunami of unintended consequences, guys, as a cop-out. It might not be pursued to pacify external or internal actors, and it is not a deliberate attempt to exclude the majority of citizens from the democratic policy-making process. It is simply one byproduct of the background within which the Indian intellectual class operates. The Indian elites are more likely, because of their background, to engage with global experts in policy dialogues that have little relevance to the commoner in India. In the next sections, we discuss the flailing state and the demographics of the Indian elite. We then illustrate with case studies on maternity leave, housing policy, open defecation, and right to education policy, how India passes laws and policies that make sense to the elite but are neither relevant nor beneficial to the vast majority of Indians. We conclude with a discussion of the optimal governing and learning environment when state capacity is limited. Now, a subchapter in the paper begins called The Flailing State, and I would like to remind you guys to check out the link in the pinned message of this live chat as well as in the description box. Remember to consider donating to my project called the Kaal Bhairav Ashtakam Vigilance music video project. And the paid members of the channel will get to come online and discuss this paper after we are done discussing, after I'm done discussing this, and then we will have a discussion amongst ourselves as well. The link for joining in the live stream has been given in a members only community post. Okay, check it out. So the flailing state. Let me have a sip of tea. Zira, this is live. Gautam Varun, research papers are apples and oranges comparison, okay? Because books are much more broader and larger, no? Research articles are about one specific topic or one specific incident, something like that. In India, corruption often takes the form of circumventing the law. Obviously, corruption, circumventing the law. Some 30% of drivers' licenses are estimated to be fake. Of the licenses that aren't fake, a large number of drivers manage to avoid taking the driver's test, which leads to unqualified drivers and more accidents on the roads. It's possible to tell a story in which these outcomes are a design from the top, but it's more realistic to see them as a consequence of agents who do not obey principles, a flailing state. In China, this kind of corruption leads to executions. The executions don't happen in India, one feature or bug of democracy, but that shouldn't be taken to imply acquiescence, let alone approval. Despite some of its own problems with corruption, India's top level bureaucracy is of very high quality. The rot in India usually does not come from the head. Interesting. Part of the problem is a simple lack of personnel. India, for example, has unsurprisingly few government workers. About one-fifth as many per capita as the United States. The number of police per capita, for example, is only 135 per 1 lakh, one of the lowest rates in the world and far below the median 318 or mean 333 of police officers per 1 lakh capita in the rest of the world, according to UN Office on Drugs and Crime Statistics of 2017. Moreover, a significant number of the police are assigned to VIPs rather than to protecting the public at large. People who are opposed to gun rights, listen to your elites when they show you the finger and have bodyguards for themselves. LOL. The number of judges per capita, 12 per million, is far below the US rate of 108 per million, which helps to explain India's enormous backlog of 32 million cases, millions of which have been in process for more than a decade. Although most of India's governance problems can find links to the lack of manpower in state services, there is also the problem of regulatory overload. The top levels of government impose a massive regulatory burden that is increasing each year, with little attention paid to personnel and state capacity. Many regulatory and civil offenses are increasingly categorized as criminal offenses and arbitrarily enforced. India has essentially all the inspections, regulations, and laws a developed country such as the United States has, but at approximately $235 of federal spending per capita, the Indian government cannot simply accomplish all the tasks it has assumed. And people think, wait, no. I get it, India has spent all this money into trying to solve these problems, even though they haven't been able to. But you see, just let the Indian state spend a little bit more of your money and my money, and only then the solutions will come about. Just a little more money, just wait for it, a little more of a decade. Consider US federal government spending per capita was 5 times higher in 1902 than Indian federal government spending per capita in 2006. Yet the Indian government circa 2006 was attempting to do much more than the US government did in 1902. Rishabh is asking, when's this paper from? Good question. Around 2017, I think. Oh, 2019. Yeah, 2019, Rishabh. The lack of state capacity relative to ambition doesn't simply mean the government does everything at a proportionately smaller scale. No, that's not what's happening. Just because they have lesser money doesn't mean they do lesser amounts of it really well. They do big ambitious amounts of it really shittily. That's not what's written in the paper. I was adding that. Lol. The lack of capacity creates diseconomies and problems such as corruption that reduce capacity even more than resources. Consider New York City's system of A, B, and C rankings for restaurant hygiene. Even though there are peculiarities in the data, such as bunching, that suggests ratings are somewhat manipulated, the system works tolerably well. Why? The incentives on both the inspector side and the restaurant side generate a stable low evasion equilibrium. Inspectors, for example, are paid up to $37 an hour, which is likely higher than their next best wage. Thus, health inspectors earn a rent. Because a wage rent would be lost if the inspectors lost their jobs, inspectors have an incentive to follow the rules even when the probability that they might be caught accepting a bribe is low. The wage rent earned by inspectors, the food inspectors, is only part of the solution, however, because if many restaurant owners offered bribes, the wage would have to be extremely high to make bribe taking unprofitable, so high that the system would be rendered uneconomic. But most restaurant owners don't offer bribes because offering a bribe to an honest inspector could lead to a worse outcome of jail than accepting the rating itself, whatever bad ratings they get. Thus, most food inspectors don't take bribes, in part because there aren't enough bribe givers to make the bribe taking profitable given the inspector's wage rent. And most restaurants don't offer bribes because there aren't enough inspectors willing to take bribes to make bribe offering cheaper than fixing the hygiene problem. Thus, health inspectors maximize utility by being honest given the actions of restaurant owners, and restaurant owners maximize utility by being honest given the actions of health inspectors. The system is in equilibrium. The evils of Western capitalism and Adam Smith, you see. The low bribery equilibrium, however, is not the only possible equilibrium. Suppose we begin with a situation in which bribery is more common, perhaps because of differences in culture such as tribal connections, that increase the cost to inspectors for not taking bribes. In this case, the same wage may not be enough to incentivize honesty on the part of health inspectors. With more restaurants offering bribes, it's more profitable to accept bribes. Moreover, inspectors' chances of being caught may decline as the number of bribes increase, what Mark Kleiman in 1993 calls enforcement swamping. At a low level of bribe taking, a small enforcement squad can capture most bribe takers, but the probability of being caught can decline as bribe taking increases. Compare this situation to vandalism and theft. Because the probability of capture is usually high, most people don't routinely smash store windows and run off with television sets. But if lots of people smash store windows and run off with television sets, then the probability of capture declines, and so more people do likewise, thus setting off a riot. Establishing a restaurant inspection system in a developing country can be like trying to create law and order during a riot. Given lots of potential bribe givers, wages can't be set high enough economically to prevent bribe taking. Given plenty of bribe takers, it's cheaper for bribe givers to offer bribes than to fix their hygiene problems. A more extensive regulatory system can simply make the problem worse by increasing the incentives to offer and take bribes. India fits this model. In Mumbai, the inspection system for restaurants is at least as strong as the system in the United States. Indeed, we have been told that it would be difficult for any restaurant to operate if it had to meet all the requirements. Inspectors' wages, however, are far lower. The ratio of inspectors to restaurants is low. Moreover, on the margin, a regulated coffee shop, for example, has to compete with the many unregulated chaiwalas and coffeewalas. The net effect is that there may be more corruption and more unhygienic restaurants than would be the case with less regulation. Andrews, Pritchett, and Woolcock give another example of enforcement swamping. One can compare actual tariff revenues with predicted tariff revenues, given tariff rates and import levels. At low tariff rates, actual revenues increase with predicted revenues, but beyond a certain level, the relationship collapses as higher rates simply create tariff evasion. Yeah, always. Other research shows that as tariff rates increase, the gap increases between what one country says it imports and what other countries say they export. So one of them lies. The lesson is that by doing more, the government can often end up accomplishing less. Now another subchapter in the paper, the Indian elite. Let me check some comments and have a sip of green tea. Good evening, Neon. Yeah, Zeroth, in this context, you'll have to remember, in general, directionally speaking, what is what. Which countries or which cities' restaurants are cleaner in general, on average, etc. Gordon Ramsay might have caught hold of a few crooked restaurants, not in general the vibe of New York. Anyone do wealth distribution by gifting membership to me so I can chat with them now? Okay, where did the paper go? Okay, let's start this subchapter called the Indian elite. So far, this is pretty juicy stuff. Elites ruling for their own benefit is a traditional public choice explanation for many laws that fail to meet their stated goals. We argue, however, that another explanation is elite imitation of foreign policies that are inappropriate given the level of domestic development. The Indian elites live at a standard of living comparable to that in developed countries and participate in the cultural and intellectual conversations in the United States, Britain, and Europe. But it is not just their economic status that sets them apart. We identify three additional characteristics of the Indian elite, especially of those formulating policy: language, caste, and education at institutions outside of India. Almost all of the Indian elite are urban and English speaking and enjoy a standard of living far above the national average. The use of English, one of India's official languages, is notable because almost all policy discussions is in English, despite the fact that English is 44th on the list of languages with the most native speakers in India. According to the Indian Human Development Survey 2005, only 16% of Indians can converse a little in English and only 4% can do so fluently. This is from 2005. I think it's largely irrelevant at the moment. Despite the fact that most Indians do not use English, the country is administered at the top mainly using English. The Supreme Court and the state high courts use English to hear arguments and write judgments. India's economic survey, similar to the economic report of the president, is in English. Think tanks hold policy debates in English. Universities and medical and technical schools teach in English. And even street signs warning of dangers are often in English. The budget speech is usually made in English before Parliament, with the finance minister making a bilingual speech for the first time in 2018. Though India has a vibrant vernacular press covering most news and opinion, academic and policy work almost exclusively appears in English language journals. Sahit Aula writes with only slight exaggeration, quote, "Imagine living in a nation where you, a member of the majority, are unable to read the label of the medicine you must give your child, the menu at a local restaurant, or even the warning signs of the road, a place where you are unable to comprehend the government document officiating your driver's license, tax filing, or marriage. This is the world that hundreds of millions of Indians live in simply because the elite prefer English. This discrimination has become so systemic that the elite and middle classes send their children to English private schools while the vast poor and theirs send theirs to the government schools of their mother tongue. Therefore, because remember, language pride is only for the poor. All the people doing the riots and the hooliganism on the streets for their mother tongue send their kids to their mother tongue government schools pretty much. But the people paying them to do that hooliganism, they send their kids to English medium elite schools. Therefore, a person's socioeconomic status in Indian society is approximately in line with his or her fluency in the language. End quote. There are both historical and economic reasons for this capture by the English-speaking elite. Starting with the policies of the East India Company and the British Crown, though the East India Company colonized vast parts of the subcontinent as early as 1757, it was not until 1835 that British officials endorsed English education in India. Thomas Babington Macaulay summarized the reason for this endorsement in his infamous Minute on Education in 1835, quote, we must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. To that class we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with terms of science borrowed from the Western nomenclature, and to render them by degrees fit vehicles for conveying knowledge to the great mass of the population." End quote. The Macaulay Committee, which gave India its first modern civil service in 1853, recommended that East India Company's patronage-based system should be replaced by a permanent civil service based on a merit system through competitive entry examinations. And I think this was centuries later when Indians all of a sudden were face to face with merit, not just connections. And immediately, a class arises out of Indian society who are absolute intellectual stalwarts and geniuses, absolute tigers, lions. Thus, one reason for Indians to acquire a British education was to attempt the examination for admittance to the Indian civil services. The Macaulay Committee, which gave India its first, this to be read, through competitive entry examinations. Thus, one reason for Indians to acquire a British education was to attempt the examination for admittance to the Indian civil services. By 1855, open competitive exams to recruit officers for the Indian civil services were held in London. Even the earliest meetings and presidential addresses of the Indian National Congress were in English. It was the common language for the agitators. It was the common language for the agitators coming together from different linguistic backgrounds within the subcontinent, and the purpose of the meetings was to send a powerful message to the British, which would be received only if it were in English. For instance, Dadabhai Naoroji published his critique of the colonial fiscal policy in English and lectured extensively in England to explain to the British government and British citizens the impact of oppressive colonial policies in India. Indeed, most of the founding members and prominent leaders of the Indian National Congress were educated in Britain. They were mostly upper caste, English speaking, and trained in law, and they had the ability to negotiate with the British government. Most famously, Jawaharlal Nehru was educated at Harrow and Cambridge and remarked to John Kenneth Galbraith that he was the last Englishman to rule India. Nehru was wrong only in thinking that he was the last. Witty sarcasm, guys, from the very serious authors. They are saying, the authors of this paper are saying, Nehru was wrong only in thinking that he was the last Englishman to rule India. No, he wasn't. Everyone else was the same. First, after independence, Indian elites continued to function as if they were governing an English-speaking country. The main reason for this was linguistic fractionalization. It was simply too costly to have many official languages, and choosing only one or two was politically infeasible. India experienced this problem during the linguistic reorganization of states in the early 1960s. The divide between the North and the South deepened, and there were significant fears of quote unquote Hindi domination among South Indians who spoke other languages. It also helped that the Indian civil service was already running the country in English. English remained both a device to reduce transaction costs and the politically neutral option. Almost the entire central administration was run using English, with states concurrently using English and the majority vernacular language. This preference for using English for administration and international trade created a demand for English speakers. Those who spoke English had access to better jobs, both in government and in the private sector, and this wage premium continues to this day. Therefore, even though the colonial masters left 70 years ago, Indian elites hold on to English as a means to better jobs, higher wages, and access to power, and as a method of administering a linguistically fractionalized nation in a centralized fashion. Over these 7 decades, a small and powerful urban English speaking elite has emerged. Among those elites, children can sometimes even grow up speaking only English. Especially with the arrival of the internet, it has become possible to be located in India, but for many practical purposes to live in a bubble and consume only American and British entertainment and writing. One author has described this new Indian elite minority as Indo-Anglians, who are about 1.4 million in number across an estimated 440,000 households. This group tends to be socially and economically forward and work mostly in the formal sector of the economy, high level government, or private sector jobs. In a study in the state of West Bengal, Tanika Chakraborty and Shilpi Kapoor Bakshi estimate in 2016 the impact of a policy established in 1983 that eliminated English as the medium of instruction in primary schools. They found that switching from English to Bengali as the medium of instruction significantly reduced wages. They also found that English medium schooling raised wages about 15% in the 2000s. These returns may be even higher in urban pockets with high levels of productivity. In a study of Dadar, a vibrant urban area in Mumbai, Maharashtra, Kaivan Munshi and Mark Rosenwig show that attending an English medium school increased both women and men's income by about 25% in the year 2000. Now, this is what solidified Bengal's caste lineages as well. Only Brahmins, Boidos, and Kaistos could afford English medium education. Meanwhile, their Komi brethren banned Bengali English education. If Neon is asking, which language would you prefer to be your lingua franca if it's not English? Well, then though Bengali. It has to be Bengali. Bengali is closest to Sanskrit, unless you make Sanskrit, which most people don't understand, and there are insane amounts of debates about the meanings of different Sanskrit sentences. First, standardize it, phase it in it, through primary school and stuff, then 12 years later, 15 years later, we can talk about making Sanskrit the official language. It's very doable. Otherwise, it has to be Bengali, because if someone knows reasonable amounts of any Sanskrit-based languages, they can understand Bengali. Compared to Dalits, upper caste with greater access to high-quality schooling, yeah. Ankita Agarwal, Jean Rees, and Ashish Gupta in 2015 find that in Uttar Pradesh, for example, high castes dominate education, business, and politics far out of proportion to their percentage of the population. Lower castes and Dalits are overrepresented among unskilled workers. Agarwal, Rees, and Gupta estimate that in the large northern city of Allahabad, 75% of the persons in positions of power are high caste compared to 21% in the population. Most notably, 86% of Bar Association members, 83% of publishers, and 76% of the Allahabad faculty are upper caste. I would bet you that all these percentages are way higher in Kolkata. This is for UP or just Allahabad. Well, even if it's for West Bengal, we would find overwhelming majority of all these positions of power that are being talked about in the context of UP. We will find in West Bengal are occupied by just three castes: Brahmins, Vaidyas, and Kayasthas. But no one talks about that because West Bengal is just considered to be a casteless society. But if we look at UP in a certain way, based on their caste breakups in different professions, based on such data, then we have to point out that these are rookie numbers if we bring in West Bengal in the comparison. Moreover, upper castes continue to dominate the elite, and Dalits hold only a tiny minority of top positions despite numerous reservation programs. In 2006, the Center for the Study of Developing Societies surveyed 40 national media organizations and found that 71% of all key decision-making jobs were occupied by upper caste Hindu men. Scheduled castes and scheduled tribes occupied none of these jobs. In a detailed analysis of Supreme Court judges, George Gadboy finds that they are predominantly upper caste men from across the nation. Though Dalits are increasing their influence in politics, bureaucracy, and policymaking, they still have a long way to go before they can break the upper caste's stronghold on political decision-making. One of the reasons for the persistence of caste is marriage endogamy. Marrying within one's own caste is both the strongest restriction of the caste system and the most important reason for the persistence of caste inequalities in India. Among the English-speaking elite in India, more than 90% of all marriages are within caste, because castes are status. See, these are nice, cool data from UP, but we won't get such data from West Bengal for some reason. In addition to language and caste, the third characteristic of the Indian elite is access to high quality education, especially higher education. Even among the upper caste, there is an elite crust of intellectuals who have the most influential voices in policy making. These voices typically belong to foreign trained intellectuals and academics. Since the time of Mohandas Gandhi, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and Jawaharlal Nehru, there has been a trend for a small group of English speaking upper caste men to be trained in foreign universities. Very few Dalits, B.R. Ambedkar being a notable exception, have managed to access the kind of educational opportunities that can gain them entry to foreign universities. During the colonial and post-independence eras in India, the relatively wealthy Indians went to British universities. As the Indian National Congress generation died out, the Indian elite became less anglicized but more American. Because of unfriendly American immigration laws until 1965, Indians preferred the United Kingdom and other countries for higher education and eventual immigration. But after 1965, the Indian immigration wave to America started, and it got a boost because of the technology boom starting in the 1990s. Since the 1990s, Indian students have come in large numbers to American universities. Among Indian elites, education abroad continues to be common, as do working and even living abroad. Since 1980, for example, only 2 of the 11 governors of the Reserve Bank of India were fully educated in India, whereas the remainder had British or US graduate degrees. Many had extensive experience living and working abroad, including Raghuram Rajan at the University of Chicago and I.G. Patel, who later became the director of the London School of Economics. Similarly, since 1980, 100% of India's chief economic advisors have had foreign graduate degrees. Perhaps most remarkably, it's not unusual in India for its policy experts to live in other countries. When Panagaria, head of the, is he from Panagar or are there other places called Panagar in India? Because Panagar is a place in West Bengal. When Arvind Panagaria, head of the Indian government think tank Niti Aayog, left India in 2017, it wasn't considered surprising that the Columbia University professor will return to the US to rejoin academia. Similarly, when Raghuram Rajan, first the chief economic advisor to the government of India and then governor of the Reserve Bank of India, left the latter job, he returned to academics in the United States. When Arvind Subramanian, Rajan's successor as chief economic advisor, ended his successful term, it was reported on his final day he completed formalities and held an informal meeting with his colleagues at his North Block office before catching his flight to the US later. On the day on the day the tenure ends, they immediately leave the country. We are not doing a good job running the country. We are not really running the country. These kinds of connections and movements are not uncommon, but they have become somewhat controversial in recent years. Yeah, why not? Rajiv Kumar, who took over as head of Niti Aayog after Panagaria left, wrote of Panagaria and Rajan that, quote, in their place, we may see experts being posted who understand India's ground realities in a much better manner, end quote. Thus, policy at the top, both in terms of discourse and often in terms of execution, is conducted mostly by English-speaking upper caste, foreign-educated Indians. Elites' education, worldview, and international orientation have important consequences for policy decisions. Imported experts may mimic the policy debates and issues that belong to a different environment, usually one with higher state capacity. These policy debates often have little relevance to the immediate problems of the average Indian, and quote unquote, and expert import may burden an already weak state. Further exacerbating the problem of executing existing policies, we turn to four case studies. But you see, all the criticisms of Indian elites that these two professors seem to be making are pretty much at par with any criticism that a Sanatan economist would make, or a Sanatan economics fanboy would make. But the criticisms of Sanatan economists against pro-free market people are the same ones. They want the Indian state to do things that are being demanded by leftist elites, and Sanatan economists don't realize that. At least they have large overlaps in agreements regarding most policies, I think. Maybe some Hindu laws would be special for Sanatan economists, which wouldn't be special for those liberal elites. But otherwise, the general welfare heavy, freebie centeredness of the Indian economy, Indian state, that's where pretty much the Sanatan economists and the leftist elites, liberal elites, have a handshake on. Maternity leave in India. As an example of a law that appeals to the elite rather than to the masses, consider India's maternity leave bill, which passed in 2017. The bill requires that firms of 10 or more workers provide women with 26 weeks of rapid maternity leave, up from the 12 weeks mandated earlier. India now requires firms to pay for more weeks of maternity leave than the United States or France. In fact, only Canada and Norway, with a GDP per capita that is 27 and 47 times higher, respectively, than India's, have longer required paid maternity leaves. The issue with and you expect Indian companies to invest in R&D. Lol. The issue with the maternity law is not simply that it is generous by world standards, especially for a poor country, but that it has so little applicability to the greater bulk of the Indian female population. Most women in India are not in the labor force, 70%. Moreover, most of the people in the labor force work in the unorganized sector, either for themselves or for firms with fewer than 10 workers, to which the law doesn't apply, 84%. Even within the organized sector, 16%. A majority of the employment is informal, 58%. So the law, again, will not apply. If we assume that 30% of the workers in the organized formal sector, which is 6.7%, are female, then perhaps 2% of the labor force are potential beneficiaries of the law. 2%. 2% of the entire labor force are potential beneficiaries of the maternity leave law. If we assume more realistically that only 20% of the workers in the organized formal sectors are female, then the law potentially applies to 1.3% of the labor force, or less than 1% of all females. In practice, the law will also be widely ignored even in the organized formal sector. Lol. Yeah, Gautam. In this monitor, I have the paper opened, and on my top monitor, I have the StreamYard screen opened. India's maternity leave bill is relevant to only a tiny share of the Indian population and is likely to have negative effects for the economy and women overall, if only because it will contribute to the general ignoring of Indian law and further pressure an Indian bureaucracy that cannot administer current law. The maternity bill is an example of what Anthony Allott called phantom legislation, the passing of laws which do not have and most probably cannot have the desired effect. The illusion of progress of doing something is given, but the reality is far different. Such legislation is an expression not of power but of the impotence of power. Well said. Why then was the law passed? To the extent that the law has beneficiaries, the beneficiaries are, of course, likely to come from the elite. Elites everywhere demand laws that benefit themselves. But the naked public choice explanation is likely incomplete. There are better ways of transferring wealth to elites than a maternity leave law. The law, however, has an ideological dimension. It's part of what the Indian elite thinks is good, just, and prestigious in the international community. Thus, when the law passed the Lok Sabha, the Labour Minister called it a gift on International Women's Day and proudly noted that Indian women will get more maternity leave than what is provided in developed countries such as Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom and South Korea. India's maternity leave law was thus a point of national pride, similar to its mission to Mars. Lol. Now, housing regulation. Before starting this subchapter, I'll just check out a few comments and have a sip of green tea. No, I don't look left. Right now, I'm looking at the right side of my body, okay? I think the screen is reversed. Live stream, how is the live stream monitor above? It's above because that's how I do background scores for all my music stuff, films, ad, everything. On one screen, the music softwares are open, and on another screen, the visuals go on. And even if I'm not doing background scores, on one screen I'll be doing just the music programming. I'll see what are the notes playing, etc., and the mixing will go on. The EQ, reverb, delay, etc., that will go on in another screen. Neon is saying the other title, Premature, Imitation, Turkey, referencing to India being a premature democracy. Not yet. We haven't seen arguments of that sort. We are mainly seeing references to India being their point is that you can imitate Western laws, but you're doing it prematurely because you don't have the state capacity to do those policies, to execute those policies for now. Okay, let's continue the paper. Housing regulation is another area where what seems normal and appropriate to the policy elite may be quite different from what is indeed what is needed by the masses. And on this topic, I implore you, I beg you to read Thomas Sowell's book called Economic Facts and Fallacies. Anyway, the problem of affordable housing in India is extreme. India has the largest slum population in the world, with about 24% of the urban population living in slums. In Mumbai, the price to income ratio is so high that the average living space is just 48 square feet per person. In comparison, the US government mandates a minimum of 50 square feet per person for prison cells. Fuck. The need for affordable housing is extreme, yet housing regulations in cities such as Ahmedabad and Surat include requirements for such matters as rainwater harvesting, solar water heating, and grey water recycling. A list that would no doubt be approved in Berkeley, California, but is far from the concerns of most people living on average Indian incomes. Other requirements specifying minimum sizes for rooms, staircases, lot sizes, and road widths are, as well as maximum levels on the floor space index, Building heights, elevators, setbacks, open spaces, and so forth are common and can greatly raise costs. Consider, for example, parking requirements. Parking requirements may seem like a sensible and natural requirement to the policy elite, but most people in India do not own cars. They use either public transportation or two wheelers. Land set aside for parking in affordable housing complexes is wasted. But more importantly, if there were less space for parking, more units could be built, spreading the cost of the land more widely and reducing rents. Further reductions in rent are possible by reducing road widths, which can be done while still satisfying requirements for emergency vehicles. Reduced road width also increases pedestrian safety. In a careful and informed analysis, Bimal Patel, Shweta Byahut, and Brijesh Bhatha in 2018 show that lifting a handful of the costliest requirements would reduce housing costs by 34% and increase supply by as much as 75% without any reduction in safety or quality of building materials. Why then have these regulations? Patel, Byahut, and Bhatha write, quote, regulations in India are also a relic from its colonial past, derived from spacious British standards that are irrelevant for popular housing today because they specify lot sizes and land uses that the majority of the poor cannot afford. End quote. So you see who gets their inspiration and ideas from Western style capitalism and who gets their defenses of policies and arguments in favor of BS policies from actual colonial masters. Hilarious, right? The regulations began in the colonial period but have been continued by India's policy elite who stepped into colonial shoes. Barjor Mehta, Bonoshri Sri Mitro, and Peter Nientiad show how little has changed. In 1989, they wrote, quote, in India, the town planning acts of the planning. In India, the town planning acts of the colonial period and even town planning efforts after independence have tended to reflect the professional values of the middle class and upper socioeconomic classes. Not surprisingly, the majority of people who cannot afford either the high standards set by the legal system or the artificially inflated costs of land are forced to seek solutions on their own and live in settlements that have come to be labeled as unplanned, unintended, uncontrolled, or unauthorized. Mehta, Mitra, and Nientiad described not only how the regulations led to expensive housing that the masses could not afford, but also how this problem created incentives to ignore the law and build slums. That is, premature load bearing that led to system collapse. Where have we heard this before? This seems like a familiar sentence, doesn't it? Premature load bearing that led to system collapse. Quote, when local governments are unable to provide affordable plots and minimal basic infrastructure, squatting is the only option left for a large number of households. In such a context, the violation of zoning and building regulations can be traced to failing housing policy. This is from 1989. Why are slums then emerging? When local governments are unable to provide affordable plots and minimal basic infrastructure, squatting is the only option left. Yes, Abhay. Caste, latrines, and the problem of open defecation. Another case study. The separation between the policy elite and the mass of the people can lead to errors of omission as well as to errors of commission. India has extreme inequalities in the provision of basic goods. It fares poorly even compared to Bangladesh, for example, in the proportion of households practicing open defecation, 55% versus 8.4% of Bangladesh. The proportion of children ages 12 to 23 months who have been fully immunized, 44% to 82% of Bangladesh, and the proportion of children ages 9 to 59 months who receive vitamin A supplements, 18% of India to 88% of Bangladesh. Damn. As Jean Gries and Amartya Sen inequality in India has a special nature, which is, quote, a huge deficiency of the basic requirements for a minimally acceptable life for the underdogs of society, end quote. That is not captured in income statistics and Gini coefficients. For example, India has far more open defecation than other countries at the same level of GDP per capita. Open defecation sickens and kills children, stunts their growth, and lowers their IQ, thus reducing the productivity of the future workforce and thus filling the country up with more socialists because of the lowered IQ. It is hard not to think that one reason this practice continues is that the divisions of caste make it a predominantly lower caste problem of little concern to the elite. Genius. Dries and Sen argue that open defecation isn't the cause of much shame or consternation among the policy elite. Quote, the possibility of space missions seems to capture the imagination of the privileged far more than flush toilets, which could liberate half the citizens of modern India from this peculiarly nasty form of inequality. And I guess Narendra Modi therefore started his mission of trying to address this problem, but of course, without people being directly accountable or without changing behaviors. People who had no problems in being outside one fine morning get free toilets paid for by other people, and other people who make the toilet also get paid salaries to administer the procedure out of your taxes. The dangers of open defecation are clear, yet some 500 million people still do not use latrines. Why not? Dries and Sen offer a typical explanation. Quote, in 2011, half of all Indian households did not have access to toilets, forcing them to resort to open defecation on a daily basis. From this perspective, the solution seems obvious. Provide access. After all, if you or I were to have access to latrines or would use them, so if someone else isn't using latrines, it must be because they don't have access. A bit of thought, however, dispels this notion. Latrines are not expensive. Many people in countries poorer than India build their own latrines. If access is not the problem, then building latrines may not be the solution, and we know now. Indeed, India's campaigns to build latrines have been far less successful than one might imagine based on the access theory. The access theory being that, oh, just if you just let people have some access to that particular product or amenity or facility, only then and immediately then will they start changing their behavior and using that amenity instead of looking for jugaad substitutes. But no, they don't. Quite often, latrines are built and not used. Sometimes this is due to poor construction or location, but the latrines are often perfectly serviceable. In fact, surveys indicate that 40% of households that have a working latrine also still have at least one person who regularly defecates in the open. For many people in India, open defecation is preferred to latrine use, usually for reasons related to issue of ritual purity and caste. Latrines in or near homes are considered polluting, not in a physical sense so much as in a spiritual or ritual sense. Latrine cleaning is also associated with the Dalit caste, in itself a polluting category. Yes, of course, if you have a temple inside your home, how will you have a toilet inside your home? That is, the impurity of defecation and caste are mutually reinforcing. As a result, using or even worse, cleaning latrines is considered a ritual impurity. The problem of open defecation is thus intimately tied up with Hindu notions of purity and caste, which many do not want to discuss, let alone condemn. In the villages, the idea of open defecation is also associated with clean air, exercise, and health. Even many women prefer open defecation if only because it gives them a chance to get out of the house and have some freedom of movement. Sadly, men sometimes build latrines for their daughters and wives to reduce their freedom of movement. Government programs that stress that it's unmanly for them to allow their wives and daughters to defecate in the open implicitly reinforce patriarchal sentiments and don't do much to reduce the transmission of germs when the men don't also use the latrines. The concept of isomorphic mimicry and pressures from external actors may also play a role in India's latrine campaign. Elites living in urban areas take the preference for having a toilet over open defecation as a given because they take for granted a modern system of plumbing connected to waste management systems. But most villagers and even most city dwellers don't have a waste management system, and using toilets often means having to deal with the waste manually. In the absence of these sewage systems, open defecation is preferred. To get around the problem of perceptions of ritual purity, it has been suggested that local governments be encouraged and enabled to construct sewage and waste management systems. A toilet that is not connected to a functional waste management or sewage system through modern plumbing needs to be which is not connected to a functional waste management or sewage system through modern plumbing needs to be pumped and the waste transported, which runs counter to perceptions of ritual purity. A toilet that flushes away human waste into the sewage and waste management system solves the problem. If there is a functional network of pipes linked to waste management and sewage systems, the cost for households to build a toilet in every home connected to the network is relatively low. At the current levels of development in India, a much smaller proportion of the population would need a government subsidy to construct a toilet. However, it is far more difficult to create sewage and waste management systems across the villages and cities in India than to build latrines. The Indian government counts the number of latrines built and input, which makes it easy to report growth and success perhaps to the world, but also to urban elites. But the government doesn't measure what is actually important, the extent of open defecation, despite the fact that it could do so at relatively low cost. As Diane Coffey and Dean Spears in 2017 remark, sometimes seeing like a state means looking away. In short, the policy elites don't suffer from the problem of open defecation and they misunderstand the problem. They believe toilets are universally preferred over open defecation, but only toilets that flush the waste away into a waste management system are preferred over open defecation. When the elites do understand the problem of open defecation as linked to ritual purity, many don't want to attack the causes such as Hindu beliefs and the caste system, or to bear the costs when the benefits may be far in the future. As a result, the problem of open defecation remains unsolved. Now, the right to education, which is an absolute disaster. Rutvik is saying this is fake analysis by colonized Adam Smith ka capitalism ka headline. No, Gautam, I haven't been able to read it as of now. Almost all developed countries have an extensive public education system. From the beginning of independent India, the Indian elite have hoped for a similar system for India. The Constitution of India, adopted in 1950, promised that the state shall endeavour to provide within a period of 10 years from the commencement of this constitution for free and compulsory education for all children until they complete the age of 14 years. More than 70 years later, the state still has not fulfilled this promise. Lol. And we have people pointlessly being obsessed with education when they would have been way better off learning another skill. At a centralized level, and that's how we create artificial numbers of unemployment. At a centralized level, the government does not evaluate learning outcomes but instead pats itself on the back by using literacy as a measure, almost entirely self-reported in census surveys, or by using enrollment numbers in all schools, public and private, as a measure of success. When one looks to outputs, not inputs, however, it is clear that public schools are failing to produce education. Yes. In the Pratham Educational Foundation's annual status of education report surveys of learning outcomes among 10 to 11-year-olds in rural India in 2014, for example, only 41% of the students in public schools could read a simple text in the local language, and only 21% could divide a 3-digit number by a 1-digit number. And today's Bengali government medium schools students today, people who are passing out today, I don't think they can answer college or master's level, undergrad or postgrad level uh, uh, question papers, even if they are written in Bengali, because the Bengali is classical Shuddh Bengali, and they have no clue how that language operates, and they don't know a sentence of English. Maybe they do because of some watching some Western OTT TV shows and stuff with subtitles. That might have helped them, and that might have been the only thing that has helped them and their generation entirely. Uh, but if they don't watch Western TV shows, their English is going to be crazy. But it might not be that relevant in the near future because of AI and real-time translations. You wouldn't believe the place I grew up in the South. I've never seen a single person doing the deed outside. But if we don't have compulsory education, how will people learn about the greatness of Akbar and Aurangzeb? Exactly. According to recent reports, the rate of open defecation in India has reduced from 73% in 2000 to less than 11% in 2022. Okay, if that report is uh, true, it's obviously incredible. I don't trust that data, but India's problem is with the kind of population we have, uh, even less than 11% people openly defecating on the streets is pretty much a number that would be as big as an entire big state in any developed country, all of whom therefore then defecate openly. The failure to educate is not surprising when one notes that teacher absenteeism in the public schools is notoriously high. Why? And I wonder why. Why these teachers, who are a lot of them who are very devout religious people from a lot of religions, including Hinduism, why aren't they following those Hindus at least? Why aren't they following their dharma of being honest? Why are they absentee teachers? None of them are atheist woke commies with transgender kids. Studies find that on a typical day of 25% of teachers are absent, and those who are present are often not teaching. Teachers in the public schools are paid salaries well higher than the national mean, and unions and political clout prevent them from being fired. Given the absence of teachers, it's not surprising that the students are often absent as well, which obviously makes learning difficult. As the government school system has failed, however, a remarkably vibrant and extensive private school system for poor children has arisen. India today has the largest private school system in the world, with about 50% of students in urban areas attending private schools and more than 30% of primary age students attending private schools overall. In some Indian states, a majority of students attend private schools. Private schools achieve modestly better outcomes than public schools, but at significantly lower cost. Modestly better outcomes than public schools, but significantly lower cost. The private school system continues to grow relative to the public school system. Over the 4-year period, 2010 through 11, 11 to 2014-15, total enrollment in government schools decreased by 11.1 million, whereas enrollment in private schools increased by 16 million. This fall in enrollment in government schools happened despite a 4.3% increase in the population of primary school age children over the same period. It's important to note that these private schools are for the poor. They could not be otherwise, given how many students attend these schools. The median private school fee in urban India in this period was 500 rupees per month, which is about $7 to $8 US dollars in 2018, and in rural India to 275 rupees per month. Nationally, private schools' mean fees are around 9.2% of the state's per capita income. The bottom line is that poor parents in India would rather pay to educate their children at a private school than send them to a government school for free. It would be difficult to find more damning and explicit evidence of the failure of the government education system. In a sensible world, a system that educates millions of poor students at low cost would be lauded and supported, but the Indian elite looks askance at these private schools and tries to expand the failing public system, often at the expense of the relatively successful private system. Primary education became a fundamental right in India after the 86th Amendment to the Constitution was passed in 2002. To translate this fundamental right into action, the Indian government crafted the Right of Children to Free and Compulsory Education Act, also known as the Right to Education Act, or the RTE of 2009, which came into force in 2010. This statute and rules crafted under it form the current framework of primary education policy in India. The RTE is a classic example of elitist thinking and isomorphic mimicry. Isomorphic means having the same form or structure. It's used to describe things that are similar in structure even if their appearance or other properties differ. Trying to establish measurable norms and standards borrowed from the developed world, which have little to no meaning in India and which foster little to no learning in school. The RT statute is essentially a laundry list of mandated inputs with no mention of learning outcomes, let alone standards for monitoring and evaluating those outcomes. The schedule to the RT lists 7 categories of norms and standards: teacher-student ratio, building specifications, minimum prescribed instructional hours, minimum working hours for teachers, provision for teaching and learning equipment, library facilities, and play material, games, and sports equipment. Within each category, there are specific requirements. For instance, under the category of building, the Act specifies requirements such as separate toilets for boys and girls, a kitchen for midday meals, office space for teachers, fencing, and playgrounds. These are the elements required for a school to be recognized by the RTE. Any school that does not meet this laundry list loses its recognition and may be forced to shut down. The RT penalizes low budget private schools. Thus, an urban private school that may not have a fenced playground is forced to shut down even when parents have chosen that school over a free public school. Moreover, the RT penalizes private schools for paying a market wage to teachers instead of the excessively high wage paid by government schools. Data on school closures are difficult to find because the states do not keep a record of all private schools and because most of these private schools are operating under the radar for violating dozens of regulations and licensing requirements. A quick survey of news reports suggests anywhere between 10,000 and 100,000 private school closures since the adoption of the RTE. A second, even more troubling trend is that the RTE creates numerous opportunities to threaten to close functioning private schools. The threat power has spurred a business of side payments to the bureaucracy and potentially raised the cost of entry to and functioning of low budget private schools that cater to the poor who are now having to pay more because of that school owner having to pay bribes to the babus. Nowhere in the RT is there any mention of measuring or evaluating learning outcomes. In fact, some provisions in the RT discourage such evaluation. Among these provisions is the requirement that no child shall be held back, expelled, or required to pass a board examination until the completion of elementary education, that is, until 8th grade. A framework that rewards the public schools the children are fleeing and punishes the private schools that have met a market test is a recipe for disaster. But the Indian elite take for granted that well stocked libraries, playgrounds, and low teacher student ratios are measures of quality, and they apply these standards universally. After all, these standards are used the world over in public education. Schools not conforming to these world standards are assumed to be cheating the poor of their hard earned money and should therefore be shut down. In the developed world, these rules of thumb work well enough because of the contextual background within which it can be assumed. To give just one example, that teachers will actually show up to teach. As Land Pritchett puts it, the narrow focus on inputs is due to the isomorphic approach to schooling that considers only those elements that are thin and hence can be bureaucratically monitored, tracked, and in principle regulated. End quote. Actual education, as opposed to measures of inputs, is a thick contextual endeavor. But the focus on, because it has many layers to it, that concept, that phenomenon. But the focus on inputs makes sense to the Indian elite and also works well for the Indian bureaucracy, which benefits from input heavy measures as well as from increased power over the fate of private schools. Conclusion. The Indian state does not have enough capacity. Oh, okay. The conclusion says limited state capacity calls for presumptive laissez-faire, guys. Libertarianism, ahoy. The Indian state does not have enough capacity to implement all the rules and regulations that elites trying to imitate the policies of developed economies desire. The result is premature load bearing and a further breakdown in state capacity. It doesn't follow that rule by non-elites would be. It doesn't follow that rule by non-elites would be better. It could be worse. Nevertheless, there are some lessons about what kinds of things can and cannot be done with limited state capacities. So the conclusion does not argue that rule by non-elites would be better. States with limited capacity have great difficulty in implementing tasks with performance goals that are difficult to measure and contested. In any bureaucracy, the agents involved ask themselves whether to perform according to the bureaucracy's goals or to their own. Incentives can ideally be structured so that goals align, but when states have limited capacity and performance goals are difficult to state or measure, it becomes easier for agents to act in their own interests. At the broadest level, this suggests that states within limited capacity should rely more on markets even when markets are imperfect, presumptive laissez-faire. The market test isn't perfect, but it is a test. Markets are the most salient alternative to state action, so when the cost of state action increases, markets should be used more often. Imagine, for example, that US government spending had to be cut by a factor of 10. Would it make sense to cut all programs by 90%? Unlikely. Some programs and policies are of great value, but others should be undertaken only when state capacity and GDP per capita are higher. As Edward Glaser quips, quote, "A country that cannot provide clean water for its citizens should not be in the business of regulating film dialogue," end quote. A US government funded at 1/10 the current level would optimally do many fewer things. So why doesn't the Indian government do many fewer things? Indeed, when we look across time, we see governments providing more programs as average incomes rise. Over the past 200 years, for example, the US government has grown larger and taken on more tasks as US average incomes have increased. But when we look across countries today, we do not see this pattern. Poor countries do not have notably smaller governments than rich countries. Indeed, poor countries often regulate more than rich countries, which is why they remain poor. The differing patterns make sense from the perspective of the folk wisdom of development economics. From this perspective, the fact that the developed economies might have started out more laissez-faire is an irrelevant historical observation. In fact, according to this view, now we are criticizing developmental economists, okay? In fact, according to this view, because the developed economies have already evidently learned that laissez-faire led to inefficiencies, business cycle instabilities, and environmental, distributional, and other ethical problems, it makes sense for the less developed economies to skip the laissez-faire stage. Thus, the folk wisdom of development economics holds that what a developing economy learns from the history of developed economies is to avoid the mistakes of relative laissez-faire and begin with greater regulation. In the alternative view put forward here, relative laissez-faire is a step to development, perhaps even a necessary step, even if the ultimate desired endpoint of development is a regulated mixed economy. Presumptive laissez-faire is the optimal form of government for states with limited capacity, and also the optimal learning environment for states to grow capacity. Under laissez-faire, wealth, education, trade, and trust can grow, which in turn will allow for greater regulation. This is the end of the paper, guys. If any member wants to join the discussion, y'all can. The link has been given in a community post, only visible to the members of the channel. This was a fun paper. We discussed an article, research paper after a long time. Premature, Imitation, and India's Flailing State. SHRUTI, Rajagopalan, and Alexander Tabarrok. Remember to donate to my Kaal Bhairav Ashtakam Vigilance project, music video project, guys. The link is in the thumbnail, in the pinned comment of this live chat, as well as in the description box. However, they will never credit Hindu for good things. Yes, exactly. Okay then, thanks a lot for joining the live stream, guys. See you in within an hour with another discussion.
যদি সবাই ফিরে যায় ওরে ওরে ও ভাগা সবাই ফিরে যায় যদি গহন পথে যাওয়ার কালে কেউ ফিরে না যায় তবে পথের কাটা তুই রক্ত মাখা চরণ তলে একলা দলরে তুই রক্ত মাখা চরণ তলে একলা দলরে যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে যদি আলো না ধরে ওরে ওরে ও ভাগা আলো না ধরে যদি ঝড় বাদলে আধার রাতে দুয়ার দেয় ঘরে তবে বজ্রানলে আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে একলা চলো একলা চলো একলা চলো একলা চলো